This is a tough story to tell, and it might be tough for some of you to hear. But this is a real story that happened to real black people in a time when no one cared about the brutality being inflicted on black people. If a black person was subjected to injustice, it was just another day. There was no need for alarm, because injustice against black people was the order of the day. It was normal and it was routine. And that's why it's so important that we tell the stories of those who lived and died in injustice. This story I'm going to tell you about today is just one of thousands. To tell this story, I need to talk a little about foreign policy in the post-World War II era. This information is crucial to understand a lot of what I'm going to talk about in this video. So give me a few moments to tell you about this, and then I'll get into what happened. The United States emerged from World War II as the world's leading democratic nation. The U.S. held immense military and economic power. This newfound global prominence drew attention to the nation's treatment of its black population. At the same time, the end of World War II marked the beginning of the Cold War, which is a decades-long ideological conflict between the United States and the Soviet Union. This wasn't a traditional war fought on battlefields, but a tense struggle for political, economic, and cultural dominance, shadowed by the threat of nuclear war. This global rivalry often exposed the contradictions in America's democratic ideals, as it promoted freedom abroad while grappling with the racial inequality at home. This glaring contradiction did not go unnoticed on the world stage, especially by the Soviet Union, which sought to exploit America's racial tensions to undermine its global credibility. As the Cold War heated up, Soviet Russia regularly denounced America's treatment of black people and tried to use this to form alliances with third world countries that the U.S. was courting in its effort to stop the spread of communism. While this negative attention to domestic race relations was bad for the U.S. government, it was good for civil rights groups in the U.S. who had long been fighting for equal rights. Pleas and cries for help at home had gone ignored, so black organizations decided to take their movement to the international stage. In 1945, the United Nations was formed. Created in the aftermath of World War II, its mission was to prevent future conflicts and provide a platform where countries could address global challenges together, including issues of justice and equality. The UN based many of its offices in the New York City area. This gave black leaders easy access to present their grievances to an international audience. Over the next 6 years, 3 black organizations, the National Negro Congress, the NAACP, and the Civil Rights Congress, each presented formal petitions to the UN protesting the treatment of black people in America. But it was the Civil Rights Congress 1951 petition that was the most controversial, because it went directly at the heart of racism and brutality and injustice in America. In 1948, the UN adopted the Convention on the Prevention of the Crime of Genocide. Included in the definition of genocide was actions with the intent to destroy a racial group. By January of 1951, over 20 nations had ratified this convention. The United States was not one of those nations. It refused to ratify it. Those who opposed it felt that it infringed on U.S. sovereignty and prevented states from handling their affairs the way they wanted to, meaning how they treated black people. William Patterson, who was the executive secretary of the Civil Rights Congress, he seized on this. The CRC decided to bring a new petition to the UN on black Americans' behalf. But this time, they based it on genocide. It moved beyond the usual accusations of discrimination and attacked the issue of racial injustice in a way that angered those in power. It accused the U.S. of committing genocide on black Americans. In 1951, the CRC filed the We Charge Genocide petition with the UN. In filing the petition, the CRC had 2 main goals. First, it wanted to expose the racism that was deeply embedded in American institutions that was evidenced by the U.S. government's refusal to ratify the Genocide Convention. And second, it wanted to raise public and international awareness of the injustice and brutality that black people face every day in the land of the free. The introduction to the petition is very powerful, and I encourage anyone who hasn't to read it. It read, "Out of the inhumane black ghettos of American cities, out of the cotton plantations of the South, comes this record of mass slayings on the basis of race, of lies deliberately warped and distorted by the willful creation of conditions making for premature death, poverty, and disease. It's a record that calls aloud for condemnation, for the end to these terrible injustices that constitute a daily and ever-increasing violation of the United Nations Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide." It sounds like it could have been written today. The petition demanded that the U.S. be punished under international law for genocidal acts committed against black Americans. It listed evidence to prove its claim. It talked about how government officials incited and encouraged vigilante groups like the Klan to commit violent acts against black people. Georgia Governor Herman Talmadge, he called for hand-to-hand fighting to prevent integration. Mississippi Senator Theodore Bilbo said to use any means to keep black men from voting. The petition also listed the incidents of violence that black people had suffered. In more than 200 pages, the petition cited 152 incidents of unarmed black men and women who lost their lives at the hands of the police and lynch mobs between the years of 1945 and 1951. The petition went on to say that once the classic method of lynching was the rope, now it was the policeman. It said that the policeman was the most visible representative of the government, and the evidence suggested that taking the lives of black people had become the policy of the U.S. government. The U.S. moved quickly to stop the UN from considering the petition, and it punished black activists who supported it. Many black activists were denied the right to travel abroad. CRC Secretary William Patterson had his passport revoked. The U.S. said that the petition was propaganda from its enemies. The incidents listed in the petition are absolutely horrific. It lists the kind of brutality that will both shock you and make you sick to your stomach. It listed incidents like what happened to 17-year-old Aletha Bell Carter in 1945. Aletha was a high school student in South Carolina who disappeared after going to a relative's house. Her father and her brother found her dead in a ditch when they went to look for her. She had been brutally beaten and violated. Authorities said that she drowned, even though evidence suggested otherwise. A white insurance agent was suspected of doing this because he was seen that day in the area washing blood off his hand. It listed Mae Noye's death. She was a 22-year-old pregnant mother of 3 who lost her life in a horrific way in 1947 in Camp Hill, Alabama. A white man named Albert Huey got into an argument with a black man and World War I veteran named Australia Farrow. Huey wanted Farrow's walking stick. When Farrow refused and said that it belonged to his grandfather and he needed it for his war injury, the two men got into a physical altercation, with Farrow getting the best of Huey. Instead of moving on and going on with his day, Huey decided that he wanted revenge. So he went home and got his weapon. He then went to the black section of town and started firing. He walked into a cafe where Mae was sitting at a table with her friends. But because Mae was pregnant and couldn't move quickly, she couldn't run away. Huey fired at her, striking her in the hip. When Mae fell to the ground and tried to crawl away, Huey fired at her again once more, this time taking her life. Huey was never held accountable for what he did. The petition listed so many more instances of terror and brutality being inflicted on black people, and I wish I could tell you about each of them, but I can't, because we'd be here for hours if I did. But I would like to tell you about another black woman listed in the petition. I want to tell you her story so that it's not lost to the halls of injustice. Nicey Brown was born Nicey Carmichael in 1874 in Alabama to John and Edie Carmichael. Because Nicey was born 9 years after black people were emancipated, it means that her parents were likely formerly enslaved black people. In 1890, when Nicey was in her late teens, she married Elijah Brown, also known as Lige. He was born in 1870, also in Alabama, to Charles and Frances Brown. His parents were born over 20 years before black people were freed, which means they too were likely enslaved. Nicey and Lige's parents lived through some of the worst times for black people. Freedom was supposed to bring equality in the hope that their children would see a promising future. But that's not what happened. Nicey and Lige grew up during a time when new ways were being created every day to keep black people bound and in chains. They saw the birth of black codes, convict leasing, peonage, and sharecropping. But despite all of this, Nicey and Lige managed to survive. They managed to survive in an environment where everything around them was trying to make them fail. Both Nicey and Lige could read and write, and they were farmers. By the year 1900, they had 3 children, a son William and 2 daughters, Lavinia and Frances. By the time 1940 came around, Nicey and Lige's family had grown. They were now in their late 60s and had several grandchildren. Despite all of the barriers that had been placed in front of black people to stop them from being successful, Nicey and Lige managed to survive. It didn't mean that they didn't face the daily indignities that black people went through, but they had managed to make it through it. Survival in Jim Crow for black people was always temporary. At any moment, the rug could be pulled out from underneath you. One second, you were alive and well, and the next, Jim Crow has stolen everything from you. And that is what happened to Nicey and Lige in 1945. On the night of June 9th, 1945, 72-year-old Nicey Brown and 75-year-old Lige Brown were at their home in Dallas County, Alabama. At home with them were 2 of their grandchildren, an 11-year-old girl and a 7-year-old boy. All of a sudden, they heard a knock at their front door. Nicey went to see who it was that was at their home so late. When she went to open the door, she saw a 26-year-old white man standing there named George Booker. Booker was a police officer for the Selma Police Department, but he was not on duty, and he was drunk. Booker asked Nicey where her daughter was. When Nicey did not tell him, Booker became angry. He tried to force his way into the house. Nicey tried to stop him, and that's when things went from bad to fatal. Booker took out a bottle or some sort of club and began beating Nicey over the head with it. Lige was in the bed and heard Nicey screaming in the commotion coming from the front room. He got out of his bed to rush to see what was going on. When he got there, Booker threatened Lige. That's when Lige went back to his bedroom and got his weapon. When he came back, Booker was still beating Nicey and she was on the floor. Lige fired his weapon at Booker to protect his wife. He struck Booker in the shoulder. Even though Lige had stopped the attack on his wife, it would not be enough to save her. Booker beat Nicey so badly that she never regained consciousness. Nicey died 2 days later. After the incident, instead of immediately arresting Booker, Lige was arrested instead. He was charged with firing at Booker and striking him in the shoulder. He was later released on the $500 bond. It was as if Jim Crow forces knew that Booker was in the wrong, but it could not let Lige go scot-free. Lige defended his wife, who was attacked in their home, and he was still arrested and charged. Booker remained hospitalized and free after the incident. But that soon changed. It was clear what happened at the Brown home, and all signs and the evidence pointed to George Booker committing a fatal crime with no defense. On June 26, 1945, a little over 2 weeks after George Booker bludgeoned Nicey Brown to death, Dallas County Sheriff James Kennedy and Deputy Sheriff William McCain arrested George Booker for taking Nicey Brown's life. Shortly after that, a grand jury began looking into what happened. After conducting its investigation and speaking to witnesses, on July 20th, 1945, it indicted George Booker. The grand jury ordered him held without bond. Now you have to remember, this was 1945 in Jim Crow, Alabama. Black people were lynched all the time and no one was ever held accountable. For a white grand jury to charge a white police officer for taking the life of a black person was significant. And the fact that the grand jury ordered Booker to remain in jail pending trial was also something that did not happen every day. It wasn't uncommon for an Alabama grand jury to refuse to indict lynchers or to hold the police accountable for their role in a black person being lynched. So this was a very significant thing that happened to George Booker. Even though Booker was charged and held without bond, the fight to hold him accountable would not be easy. Before Booker could be tried, he first challenged his detention without bond. In July of 1945, he filed what is called a habeas corpus petition. This is a legal proceeding where someone claims that they are being illegally held. Booker's attorneys called several witnesses to testify to prove that he was unlawfully held. Dr. P.Y. Donald testified that he saw small holes on Nicey's body that appeared to be buckshot. This was to imply that perhaps Lige had struck Nicey. But when questioned by the state, the doctor admitted that Nicey's skull was crushed and she died from the beating. Booker's habeas corpus petition was denied by the judge and he was ordered held until his trial. Booker's trial began on September 26, 1945. Booker was still determined to get out of what he did. The jury chosen was all white and all male. Prosecutor Joseph James hoped that the overwhelming evidence would help to convict Booker. Lige testified and told the jury how he saw Booker beating his wife to death, and he fired at Booker to protect himself and his wife. One of the grandchildren also testified and talked about how they too saw Booker beating Nicey. Booker's attorney, James Pitts, he told the jury that if they convicted Booker, who was a brave man, upholding white rule by his actions, then they might as well be giving weapons to every black person and letting them run wild through the South. And I should mention that when he referred to black people, he used a racial slur. Booker's attorney argued that this was all a lie and it never happened the way the prosecution said it did. Booker testified in his own defense. He said that on the night of the incident, he was with Mr. and Mrs. H.M. Creel and their daughter, Mrs. House, and her infant child, and another person named Sergeant Lloyd G. Bennett. He said he stopped by Lige Brown's home looking for someone named Manson, who was supposedly Lige's grandson. He said this person went by the name Snake Eater, and he was there looking for fishing bait. Booker claimed that as he approached the Browns' home, another car drove up to him, and it was driven by a black taxi driver named Sam Allen. Booker said that he asked Sam to go with him to wake up the Browns. He said they both walked up to the front door and knocked on it, and Nicey came to the door. Booker said he asked for Manson, and Nicey said he wasn't there. Booker claimed the next thing he knew, he was struck by fire and he went to the ground. He said he went unconscious, and doesn't recall anything that happened after that, but he said he never went into the Browns' home. Now, as crazy as Booker's testimony sounds, it was not so far-fetched for the all-white male jury. The jury deliberated less than 1 hour before coming back with a not guilty verdict, acquitting George Booker of all charges. The story Booker told was enough for them. Nicey Brown had lost her life. Lige Brown had to watch as a man beat his wife to death. And 26-year-old George Booker was free to live the rest of his life like nothing happened. Nicey was robbed of dignity and death. She survived so much injustice in her 72 years, only to lose her life and no one be held accountable because of racism. She didn't get to live out her days with peace and comfort. Her life came to an end in a brutal fashion. And Lige had to live with the pain and the trauma and the shame of knowing that he could not save his wife. He lived with that for the rest of his life. But not George Booker. He continued on being a respected member of his community. He lived another 58 years. He died in 2003 at the age of 83. And unlike Nicey Brown, he was given dignity in death. He was able to die peacefully, something Nicey Brown was robbed of. The We Charge Genocide petition highlighted cases like Nicey Brown's to show just how black people were being treated in the United States, to show just how far out of reach justice was for black people. This is the kind of injustice that black people were facing every single day. Injustice and brutality on all sides. And help was nowhere in sight. Only more injustice. I want to know your thoughts on this story. Had you ever heard of the We Charge Genocide petition or Nicey Brown story? And how did it make you feel learning all that she went through? Leave me a comment down below. Let me know your thoughts.